Welcome back to Midnight Fables. Tonight, we witness the price of power. Sir Elian was a man with everything to lose, and a blade that promised he would never fail. But every legend has a shadow, and every victory has a cost. Settle in for a tale of blood, iron, and the memories we leave behind. Let's begin. The rain in the gray marches did not simply fall. It clung to the world like a rotting, cold shroud, a heavy curtain of moisture that seemed to erase the horizon and pull the very sky down into the mud. It was a thick, cloying mist that tasted of ancient salt, old rust, and the metallic, unmistakable tang of blood, soaking through Sir Elian's tattered wool cloak and chilling the skin beneath his dented, mud-stained plate armor until his bones felt like they were made of ice. He stood at the edge of the Mud King's territory, a landscape of skeletal, black trees and sucking bogs that seemed to breathe with a rhythmic, wet heaving, as if the earth itself were slowly drowning in its own filth. Every single step was a grueling battle against the mire, the muck pulling at his heavy boots like the desperate, skeletal hands of the thousands who had died trying to cross this threshold before him. He could feel the weight of their failure in the very air he breathed, a thick atmosphere of despair that threatened to extinguish the last flicker of his will. In his right hand, his fingers white-knuckled and trembling, he gripped the hilt of Lament. It was a beautiful weapon, an obscenity of elegance in a land of absolute, unmitigated rot. The crossguard was fashioned from silvered bone, intricately carved by some forgotten master, into the shape of weeping angels whose wings formed the quillons, and the blade itself was a ribbon of dark, Damascus steel that seemed to drink the meager light of the moon rather than reflect it. They called it the Sword of 10 Strengths in the songs of the high courts. But among the desperate, the dying, and the truly cursed who walked the fringes of the world, it was known by its truer, more terrifying name, the Memory Eater. It was a relic from a pre-cataclysmic age of cruel, forgotten magic, a blade that offered salvation only at the cost of the self, a literal exchange of history for power. Elian looked at his reflection in a stagnant pool of water, a dark, oily mirror framed by dead, yellow reeds and the bleached bones of small creatures that had lacked the strength to escape the bog. He saw a man in his 40th year, his face a map of deep, jagged failures and hard-won scars that never quite healed. His hair was streaked with the premature gray of a long, bitter winter, and his eyes, once the bright, piercing blue of a summer sky that his wife had fallen in love with, were now the color of a cold, receding tide under a leaden, indifferent sky. He tried to think of his home, the sun-drenched vineyards of Valerius, where the air smelled of lavender, blooming jasmine, and ripening fruit in the late August heat. He closed his eyes, straining to summon the sound of the wind through the ancient silvery olive trees and the rhythmic, comforting clinking of the harvest shears against the vines. He could almost hear the laughter of a small child echoing through those fading memories, a sound like silver bells in a cathedral. "Mina," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a jagged piece of cold flint. The name felt like a prayer, or perhaps a final, desperate curse intended to keep him tethered to the world of the living for just one more day. He reached into his leather pouch with a trembling, mud-caked hand and pulled out a small, wooden doll, a crudely carved knight with a missing arm and a chipped helmet. It was the only physical object he had left to remind him of why he was crossing this hellscape. The Mud King had taken her during the midsummer raid, dragging her into the dark pits of the Citadel. He had taken her because Elian, the once great captain of the guard, had been too drunk on the wine of his own past glory to stay at his post. He had been celebrating a victory in a tavern while his own house was being turned to ash and his daughter was being dragged into the mist. To save her, he knew he needed more than a drunkard's strength or a hollow, tarnished title. He needed the blade. He gripped the silvered bone hilt tighter, feeling the leather wrap pulse with a faint, rhythmic heat that matched the frantic, uneven thud of his own heart. The sword was hungry. It was a sentient void wrapped in steel. It had been 3 long days since he had drawn it to slay the screeching bog ghouls at the border, and he could still feel the phantom itch in the back of his mind where those memories used to be, a mental scar that throbbed with every step. The name of his first horse was gone, replaced by a cold blankness. The face of his mother was now a blurred smear of color in his mind, like a watercolor painting left out in a relentless, pouring storm. He could remember the concept of a mother, the idea of maternal warmth, but not the woman herself or the sound of her voice. He knew he had been loved once, but the warmth of that love had been digested by the Damascus steel to fuel his journey through the marches. One more time, Elian told the oppressive, heavy silence of the marsh, his voice sounding thin against the wind. Just enough to reach the Citadel, just enough to bring her back to the light. And then I will bury you in the deepest, darkest trench of the marsh, where no one will ever find you again, you wretched, hungry thing. He stepped forward, the mud rising to his knees, thick, cold, and smelling of sulfur. Ahead, the black towers of the Citadel rose like jagged, broken teeth against the bruised, purple sky lit from below by the sickly green fires of the Mud King's furnaces. He didn't know if he would even recognize his daughter's face when he finally found her in the dark, but he knew he would kill the world and everyone in it to get to that room. He reached for the scabbard, his fingers brushing the cold bone of the hilt, waiting for the moment he would have to pay the iron price once again. The sound of the blade leaving the leather sheath was not a metallic ring. It was a long, low sigh of satisfaction. A soft, exhaled breath that sounded like a lover's whisper in a dark, empty room. As the steel met the damp, sulphurous air of the marsh, Elian felt a surge of white-hot heat rush up his arm, settling deep in the marrow of his bones and setting his nerves on fire. His muscles, which had been weary, cramped, and screaming from days of trekking through the thick sludge, suddenly swelled with a terrifying, unnatural power. The fatigue vanished instantly, replaced by a crystalline clarity that made his previous existence feel like a distant, flickering dream of a lesser man. He stood tall, his armor no longer feeling like a burden, but like an extension of his own skin, hard and unyielding. His vision sharpened until the world became a high-contrast map of targets, trajectories, and thermal signatures. The darkness of the marsh was no longer a veil. He could see the individual veins on the leaves of the hanging moss and the way the moisture beaded on the obsidian bark of the dead trees. He could hear the frantic, tiny heartbeat of a marsh rat 50 yards away under a fallen, rotting log, and the steady, slow drip of stagnant water from a nearby branch. Most importantly, he could see the movements of the Mud King's sentries, bloated, pale things with skin like wet parchment and spears made of sharpened rib bones, lurking in the shadows. They were waiting for him, but they were not prepared for the storm that was about to break upon them. But as the power took hold, the toll was paid in full, and the sword began its feast. Elian felt a sudden, sharp pinch at the back of his skull, a sensation like a silken thread being snapped by a pair of invisible shears. He tried to grasp at the thought that had just been there, a memory of a summer festival in the capital, the taste of a specific honey cake his wife used to bake for his birthday every year. It was there for a heartbeat, a golden flicker of happiness, then it was gone. A void opened in his history, a blank space where 20 years of life had once lived. He reached for it, but his fingers found only cold, gray smoke. He couldn't remember the color of his wedding day or the words of the vows he had spoken. He couldn't remember the song his father sang at the hearth on winter nights to ward off the cold. He didn't have time to mourn the loss of his own soul, for the sentries had spotted him and were closing in. They moved with a wet, sloshing sound, their pale bodies glistening in the moonlight like giant, predatory slugs. There were 6 of them, towering monsters of fat, hatred, and grafted armor. Normally, a man alone would be slaughtered in seconds by such a force. But Elian was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for the blade's ancient, insatiable hunger. He moved through the thick mud as if it were mountain air, his feet barely touching the ground. Lament felt weightless in his hand, a silver streak of death that cut through the night with terrifying speed. The first sentry didn't even have time to raise its bone spear before Elian's blade sheared through its neck, the spine snapping like dry kindling. He didn't feel the impact. He only felt the sword drinking the life force of the creature, a rush of stolen energy that made his vision swim with gold. It hummed against his palm, a low vibration of pure dark satisfaction. By the time the last sentry fell, Elian was standing in a circle of black, oily blood. He felt no disgust, only a cold, terrifying efficiency that radiated from the sword into the very center of his heart. He was breathing hard, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer, terrifying adrenaline of the blade's connection. He looked down at the wooden doll in his left hand, his fingers stained with the black, foul-smelling ichor of the marsh things. He knew it was important. He knew it was the anchor that kept him from drifting away into the dark, silent void entirely. But as he looked at the carved knight, he couldn't remember who had carved it for him, or why the missing arm on the toy felt like such a profound, soul-crushing tragedy. Was it a gift from a friend, a relic of his own childhood? The answer was a hollow echo in a locked room. The sword had taken the why and left him only with the how. He tucked the doll back into his pouch, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach where his heart used to be. He was stronger now than he had ever been in his youth, stronger than any knight who had ever served in the king's guard. But he was less of a human than he had been 10 minutes ago. He looked at the Citadel towers, closer now, their obsidian walls weeping with the moisture of the marsh. He wondered how much of Sir Elian would be left by the time the gates finally opened. He wondered if there would be anything left to go home to, even if he managed to survive the night. The interior of the Citadel was a nightmare labyrinth of damp, weeping stone and flickering green torches that cast long, distorted shadows across the salt-stained floors. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of old stagnant water, wet fur, and the low, rhythmic chanting of the Mud King's priests, a sound that vibrated in Elian's chest like a second, mechanical heartbeat. He moved through the corridors like a ghost, his armor no longer clanking against the stone, but sliding silently through the gloom as if he were part of the shadows themselves. Every breath he took was measured, every movement calculated to maximize the carnage he was about to unleash upon those who had dared to take what was his. Every few steps, he would draw the blade to strike down a lurker in the darkness, a mutated servant, a warped hound of the bog, or a guard with skin grafted to rusted, ancient mail. And every time the Damascus steel sang its hushed, whistling song, another piece of his life was severed and consumed. He forgot the name of the king he had served for 2 decades. He forgot the layout of the city he had spent his life protecting from northern raiders. He even forgot the feeling of being truly drunk, the warmth of the wine in his belly, the sting of the morning sun after a night of revelry with his brothers in arms. It was all being replaced by the cold, metallic taste of lament. He was becoming as hard, sharp, and unyielding as the steel he carried. He stopped before a massive, arched mirror in a gallery known as the Hall of Echoes. The glass was cracked and fogged with centuries of age, but the reflection was clear enough to see the monster he was becoming in real time. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him from the silvered surface. face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp as razors, and his eyes were glowing with a faint, unnatural silver light that seemed to flicker with the beat of the sword's pulse. He looked like a creature of the marsh himself, a predator born of mud, shadow, and stolen memories. He reached up to touch his face, and the coldness of his own skin startled him. "Who are you?" he asked the reflection, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together in a tomb. The reflection didn't answer. It only tightened its grip on the silvered bone hilt, the weeping angels on the crossguard seemingly mocking his confusion with their stone-faced sorrow. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the wooden doll. He stared at it for a long, agonizing time, his mind searching for a connection that wasn't there. It was a toy, a child's plaything. Why was he carrying a toy into a fortress of death? What possible value could a piece of carved pine have in a place like this? He felt a wave of grief wash over him, but it was a hollow, echoes of a dream grief, a phantom pain from a limb that had been amputated long ago. He knew this object meant everything to him, the reason for every drop of blood he had spilled today, and every memory he had traded. But he could no longer remember the girl's face. He could no longer remember the sound of her voice calling him Papa when he returned from the hunt, or the way she smelled of sun and fresh grass. He could see the shape of a memory, the silhouette of a feeling, but the substance was gone, eaten by the insatiable blade. "Mina," he said, testing the word on his tongue. It was a sound without a meaning, a name for a stranger in a story he had once read. He repeated it, trying to find the spark, the fire that had driven him to this place. Mina, Mina, Mina. It was just a name, a collection of syllables. He felt a surge of rage, not at the Mud King who had stolen her, but at the blade in his hand that was slowly erasing him. He tried to sheath it, to throw it away into the dark, dusty corners of the hall, but his fingers wouldn't move. The silvered bone hilt was fused to his palm, the dark metal a part of his very nervous system. The sword wouldn't let him go until the debt was paid in full. It had a purpose for him, and it would not be denied its meal. He turned away from the cracked mirror and began to climb the spiral stairs that led to the central spire, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic thud against steps worn deep by centuries of use. The air here was thinner, smelling of ozone and ancient, stagnant magic. The chanting was louder now, a dissonant guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the tower and made the stone weep a thick black oil. He was close. He could feel the presence of his enemy pulsing through the floorboards like a fever, and the presence of the one he had come to save, though her identity was now little more than a fading concept, a ghost of a reason in a mind made of steel. Each step was an echo in a house that was slowly being emptied of its furniture, leaving only the bare, cold walls and the draft of the coming winter. He climbed with a relentless mechanical pace, his heart no longer racing with fear or anticipation, but beating with a slow, heavy finality that matched the tolling of a funeral bell. The top of the tower was an open platform, exposed to the swirling black mists and the biting, sulphurous wind of the gray marches that howled like a wounded beast. In the center, sitting upon a throne made of fossilized bone and dried, cracked mud, sat the Mud King. He was a bloated, ancient thing, his skin like wet parchment stretched over a frame of rotted timber and rusted iron. He wore a crown of jagged obsidian that seemed to bleed darkness into the air, obscuring his eyes and leaving only a lipless, grinning mouth visible. At his feet, huddled in a cage of iron wire that looked like a bird trap, was a small girl. Her dress was torn and filthy, her face smeared with soot and tears, but her eyes, the same winter sea blue as Elian's, were bright with a terrifying, desperate hope that pierced through the gloom. When she saw the armored figure emerge from the shadows of the stairwell, she let out a cry that should have shattered a man's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Father, you came. I knew you'd come for me." Elian stood at the edge of the platform, Lament held low at his side, its blade dripping with the black ichor of the guards he had butchered on his way up. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of rain and ancient rot, whipping his tattered cloak like a funeral shroud. He heard the word, Father. He understood the definition of it in a dry academic sense. A man who protects, a man who provides, a man who loves. But the connection, the visceral, hot-blooded cord that bound a parent to a child, was dead, severed by the Damascus steel. He looked at the girl and felt nothing but a distant, analytical pity, as if he were observing a bird with a broken wing. She was a task to be completed, a mission to be fulfilled, an object to be recovered from the dark. He was no longer a father, he was an executioner. He looked at the Mud King, and for the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of something that resembled a human emotion, a cold, hard desire for an end to the silence. He raised the sword, and the weeping angels on the hilt seemed to cry out in anticipation of the blood to come. The captain of the guard, the Mud King, hissed, his voice sounding like the bubbling of a swamp gas in a stagnant pond, wet and heavy with malice. You have brought me my favorite prize, the Memory Eater. Do you even remember why you hate me, Sir Elian? Do you remember the fire that took your stable and the horses screaming in the night? Do you remember the cries of your men as the bog took them one by one while you watched from the ridge, paralyzed by your own failures? The king laughed, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself, shaking the stones of the platform. Elian didn't speak. He couldn't. The words for hatred and revenge had been taken hours ago, swallowed by the Damascus steel as it granted him the strength to climb these stairs. He was a vessel of pure, cold intent, a weapon forged for a single, final purpose. You came for the girl, the king laughed again, a spray of filth hitting the stone floor as he stood. But look at you. There is nothing left for her to love. You are a hollow shell, held together by a cursed piece of iron and a handful of forgotten promises. You have won the battle to reach me, knight, but you have already lost the war for your own soul. You are a ghost, and she is a prisoner of a dead man. The king rose from his throne, clutching a staff made of human vertebrae that hummed with a sickly green light. He gestured with a clawed hand, and the shadows of the tower began to coalesce into a swarm of shrieking spirits, the ghosts of every man Elian had ever failed, every friend he had ever watched die. The final battle had begun. Elian raised the sword. He didn't hesitate. He didn't fear the dead. He stepped into the fray, a master of a craft he had forgotten he possessed. He moved with a speed that defied the laws of the physical world, the dark steel of Lament cutting through the spirits as if they were nothing more than morning mist. But with every swing, with every life he extinguished and every shadow he dispersed, the final remnants of his humanity were being fed into the furnace of the blade. He forgot the scent of lavender in his garden during the spring. He forgot the feel of a soft bed after a long campaign. He forgot the taste of fresh bread and the warmth of a hearth fire. He was a machine of death, and his fuel was nearly gone. The Mud King fought with desperation, summoning waves of black bile, but Elian was an inevitable force. He split the king's staff with a blow that shattered the vertebrae. Then he brought the blade down through the obsidian crown. The king dissolved into a puddle of black silt, and the darkness began to leak out of the walls, the citadel finally beginning to crumble into the marsh. The silence that followed the king's death was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from the platform. The shrieking spirits vanished back into the mist like smoke in a gale. The oppressive weight of the citadel seemed to lift, replaced by a cold, indifferent wind that smelled of the coming winter. Elian stood over the remains of his enemy, the sword glowing with a blinding silver intensity that illuminated the ruins. It was full. It had eaten the last scrap of the man he used to be, leaving only the warrior. He turned toward the iron cage. The girl was staring at him, her chest heaving with jagged, rhythmic sobs. She reached out through the wires, her small, dirty hand trembling with a fear that he could no longer comfort. "Father?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Elian looked at her, his silver eyes reflecting nothing of the man she knew. He saw a child. He saw a survivor of a tragedy. He saw the objective of his long, bloody journey through the marches. But he did not see a daughter. The memory of her birth in the middle of a thunderstorm, the sound of her first cry that had moved him to tears, the way she used to hold his thumb when she was a babe, it was all gone, digested by the steel. He felt like a man looking at a stranger's portrait in a gallery, admiring the technique but feeling no connection to the subject. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the wooden doll. He realized with a cold, logical clarity that this object belonged to her. He walked to the cage and used the sword to shear through the iron wires as if they were wet silk. The girl scrambled out and threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his blood-stained cloak. She smelled of smoke, salt, and terror. Elian stood perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides like lead weights. He didn't return the embrace. He didn't stroke her hair or tell her she was safe. He felt like a statue being touched by a bird. He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, a ghost of a feeling passed through him, a phantom limb of love that throbbed with a dull ache. Then it too was gone, snuffed out by the cold hum of the blade. The descent from the Citadel was a long, silent journey through a landscape that was slowly reclaiming itself. The mists were retreating, the black bogs settling into a quiet, stagnant peace. Elian walked with a steady, tireless gait, the girl clutching his hand with a grip that spoke of a terror she couldn't name. She talked to him as they walked, her voice a constant hum against the heavy silence of the night. She told him about the dark things the Mud King's servants had whispered to her in the pits. She told him about her dreams of home, the way the sunlight hit the kitchen table in the morning. She talked about a dog named Barnaby and a horse named Star. She was trying to bring him back, but the man she was talking to was already dead. Elian listened to her voice as they crossed the border of the marches. But the words were just sounds, data points in a narrative that belonged to someone else entirely. He was learning about a man named Sir Elian through the testimony of a witness, piecing together a life he no longer possessed. He learned that he liked his tea with honey. He learned that he was a terrible singer, but did it anyway to make her laugh on rainy days when the vineyards were flooded. He learned that he had promised her, on the night before the raid, that nothing in this world or the next would ever keep them apart. He nodded when she looked at him for confirmation, mirroring the movements of a father without the heart of one. He was a shadow being led by a sunbeam back into the world of the living. As they reached the edge of the gray marches, the sun began to break through the leaden clouds for the first time in weeks. It was a pale, golden light that turned the retreating mist into a sea of diamonds, a beauty that Elian could observe but not feel. The girl stopped and looked up, a smile breaking across her face that made her look like the sun itself. "Look, Father, the sun is back! You said you'd bring the sun back for us." Elian looked at the sky. It was bright, it was yellow. He understood the physics of it, the light, the heat, the atmospheric pressure. But he felt no joy. He felt no relief from the cold that had settled in his marrow. He felt nothing but the weight of the steel against his leg, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. The manor was exactly as the girl had described it in her stories. The great oak tree stood in the backyard, its leaves rustling in the breeze like silk. The vineyards were heavy with purple fruit, ready for the harvest that Elian would no longer know how to lead. A large, shaggy dog, Barnaby, came running to meet them, barking with a frantic, wagging joy that Elian could not mirror. Elian sat on the porch, his back against the weathered wood, his armor still covered in the filth of the Citadel. He watched as a woman ran from the house, her hair flying wild behind her. She was beautiful, her face etched with a mixture of agony and disbelief. She fell to her knees as she reached the girl, pulling her into a fierce, desperate hug that seemed as if it would never end. Then she looked up at Elian, her eyes brimming with tears that caught the light. "Elian," she breathed, the name a sob. "You're home. Oh gods, you're home. I thought I'd never see you again." Elian looked at her, searching his mind for a spark. He recognized the face that had blurred into ash in his memories. This was his wife, but she was a stranger in his own house. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was cold, his touch clinical and distant, lacking the warmth of a husband's embrace. He felt the wetness of her tears, but they did not move him to comfort her. "You are safe," he said, his voice flat and monotone, devoid of the cadence of love. "The child is safe. The Mud King is dead. The debt is paid in full." She flinched at his tone, a small shadow of confusion and hurt crossing her face like a cloud over the sun. She took his hand, her own warmth a stark contrast to his icy, unyielding grip. "Elian, what happened out there in the dark? You look like you've seen the end of the world." "I have seen the price of a life," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the marsh met the sky. He watched them move through the house that evening, a silent observer of a life he once owned. They lit candles against the encroaching twilight. They prepared a meal of bread and wine. They looked at him with a mixture of profound love and a growing, terrifying realization that the man who had returned was not the man who had left. He was an echo in a room. He was a ghost sitting in a chair, a weapon resting against the table where his family ate. Late that night, when the house was finally quiet and the moon was high, Elian stood in the center of the kitchen. He looked at the wooden doll sitting on the table, the crude little knight that had been his only anchor in the storm. He picked it up one last time, feeling the rough grain under his thumb, searching for a spark of the man he used to be. He felt a faint, phantom tug in his chest, a memory of a love he could no longer feel. He walked into the girl's room and placed the doll on her pillow as she slept, her breathing slow and rhythmic. He realized that this was his final act as a father, to leave her with the hero she remembered, rather than the monster he had become. He walked back to the porch and picked up the sword. The silvered bone hilt felt more natural in his hand than the touch of his wife's skin. He walked to the edge of the vineyard, where the thick woods began to climb toward the mountains. He didn't look back at the house, at the life he had fought so hard to save. "Where are you going?" He stopped. It was his wife, standing in the doorway in her nightdress. Her voice was breaking. Elian didn't turn around. "The world is full of mud kings," he said, the sword humming at his side. "And I am a man with a very sharp sword. I am a weapon, Elena, and weapons do not belong in gardens." "But we love you," she cried out into the night. "You love a man who died in the marsh," he replied, stepping into the trees. "I am just the thing that brought his daughter home." He disappeared into the shadows, the darkness swallowing him whole. He would wander the dark places of the world, a knight with no name and no history, drawing the blade until there was nothing left but iron and silence. He was the sword that remembers, even if he was the man who forgot. The king is dead, the daughter is safe, but the man who saved them is gone forever. If you found the strength to win, but lost the reason why, would it be worth it? Thank you for joining us at Midnight Fables. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, please consider liking and subscribing for more tales of the forgotten. Sleep well, if you can.